When you think of the most powerful people in history, names like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, or Napoleon Bonaparte probably spring to mind. These people led armies across continents, conquered vast swaths of land, and reshaped the course of human history. But what if these legendary conquerors had lost their battles, not to another country, not to rival kings, but to rabbits? Welcome to my channel, and today we're answering the extraordinary question, how do you defeat Napoleon? With more than 300 victories under his belt, Napoleon is widely considered one of the greatest generals in the world. However, he wasn't invincible. In fact, he faced defeat in one of the most peculiar battles in history, and all because he wanted to go hunting. In the year 1804, Napoleon set out with an entourage of courtiers and soldiers for a leisurely day of shooting birds. While passing through a small village, his men decided to pick up some local color. Hundreds of peasants were rounded up for a little sport. Napoleon would have a chance to practice his marksmanship, and the commoners would get to see the famous general. It was a win-win situation, or so everyone thought. But the emperor's men had no idea what kind of reception they were about to get from the villagers. When it was time for the hunt to begin, the crowds were herded into a large clearing where hundreds of cages were opened, releasing hundreds of rabbits. The plan was simple. The peasants would capture the animals and then hand them over to Napoleon for him to personally shoot. He would show off his skills while racking up a body count, and everyone would head home happy. But there was one problem. No one caught the rabbits. As soon as the cages were opened, the animals took off running. Now, ordinarily, a rabbit is preyed upon by foxes, hawks, snakes, and humans. They are not known for their fighting prowess. However, these particular rabbits didn't run away. They charged straight towards the stunned crowd. It was pure pandemonium. Peasants were overwhelmed by the charging lagomorphs. They dropped to their knees, raised their hands in surrender, and desperately tried to fend off the onslaught of furry bodies tackling them. This was not how the afternoon was supposed to go. Napoleon watched in disbelief as his soldiers and courtiers were attacked by rabbits. They were bitten and scratched, and in some cases even blinded. Some of the soldiers panicked and fell to their swords, accidentally slaying one another. But before long, Napoleon was also at the mercy of the fluffy horde. He could do nothing as the rabbits climbed all over him. He tried to brush them off, but it was no use. They clung to his coat and hat. They bit his fingers and ears, and in sheer desperation, he swatted at them with his cane. It was useless. There were simply too many rabbits and not enough soldiers. The furious emperor felt his dignity slip further and further away as the animals got all over his carriage. His guards scrambled to escape the situation, but it was pointless. The rabbits jumped onto the carriages and refused to leave. They chewed on the upholstery and peeked out the windows, seemingly taunting the trapped men inside. As dusk began to fall, Napoleon and his companions finally made a break for it. They left behind their wounded men and abandoned carriages overrun by rabbits. It was one of the greatest defeats of his life, and it happened because Napoleon had ignored one very important detail. The rabbits weren't wild animals. They were tame farm rabbits. The peasants knew the animals well and had anticipated their behavior. When they saw the cages being opened, they immediately realized that something was wrong. Why were so many rabbits being released at once? What was going to happen to them? They knew they were in danger when the animals started charging, and they knew that the only way to survive was to run to the safety of the forest. Unfortunately, the soldiers and courtiers didn't know any of this. They were completely caught off guard and totally unprepared. Now, if Napoleon had been facing a wild colony of rabbits, there's a good chance the battle would have gone differently. Wild rabbits are skittish creatures. They don't usually charge people, but the farmyard rabbits didn't know any better. They were friendly with humans. They had no predators to fear, and they certainly weren't afraid of Napoleon. In fact, the rabbits probably saw the soldiers as friends. When they saw those cages being opened, they thought it was feeding time. That's why they charged. They were hungry and wanted to get their paws on some fresh carrots. Instead, they got a taste of something much fiercer. There were dozens of people bitten during the skirmish, and a few were blinded when the animals scratched out their eyes. Some of the soldiers retaliated, but that just made the situation worse. The blood in the water attracted even more rabbits, and soon there were thousands of animals swarming around the soldiers. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and the casualties were mounting. Napoleon desperately needed a way out, but his men were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by furry bodies. The emperor's only option was to try and calm the animals down. He stepped out of his carriage and held his arms out like an octopus. It was a bad idea. The rabbits saw the exposed flesh and charged forward. They gnawed on his coat and nearly knocked him to the ground. He waved his cane wildly, hoping to scare them away, but that just made them bolder. Finally, the animals seemed to be satisfied. They left Napoleon alone and turned their attention back to the carriages. The emperor seized his opportunity and ran for the hills, retreating to the nearest town. Once he got there, he was able to find some fresh horses and drive back to his palace. He was covered in scratches and bites and humiliation. No one had ever seen anything like it. The story of Napoleon's defeat spread like wildfire and was the talk of Europe for months. People couldn't believe that such a great leader could be bested by a group of rabbits. Napoleon himself was furious. He vowed revenge against the peasants and ordered that the village be burned to the ground. He never forgave them for what they did to him and his soldiers. But that didn't make up for the fact that he had lost face. This was a man who had defeated entire armies, a man who had built an empire that stretched from Spain to Russia. He couldn't even defeat a bunch of farm rabbits. To make matters worse, he was mocked mercilessly by his enemies. They painted pictures and made sculptures of Napoleon getting mauled by rabbits. They wrote stories and songs about his humiliating defeat. He became the laughingstock of Europe. But perhaps Napoleon should have seen it coming. After all, he had picked up a reputation for animal cruelty earlier in his career. In 1796, when he was just a general, he was given command of the French army in Italy. It was an important position, and Napoleon was eager to prove himself. He had heard that the Austrians were taunting the French troops, calling them rabbits. So Napoleon decided to teach them a lesson. He rounded up hundreds of rabbits and set them loose near the Austrian lines. The next morning, the French awoke to the sight of thousands of dead rabbits lying around their camp. It was a warning, and Napoleon had sent a message. He was not to be trifled with. Unfortunately, he never received that memo. When the peasants released those rabbits into the clearing, Napoleon took it as a personal insult. He thought they were trying to humiliate him just like the Austrians had done. He should have known that they weren't thinking about his reputation, though. They were scared for their lives. If Napoleon had listened to them, maybe he could have avoided the fiasco. But he didn't, and instead he suffered the worst defeat of his life at the paws of rabbits. Now you need to watch What If Animals Went to War, or check out Did Ancient Rome Ever Exist?